They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Well, at 72 years old, I've had plenty of time to let mine chill. My name is Dorothy, though most folks called me Dot. And if you think you know how this story ends just because I'm an old woman, you're dead wrong. Before I tell you what I found in that garage that changed everything, I need you to know where you're watching this from. Drop a comment below and tell me your city, your state, your country, because what happened to me could happen to anyone, anywhere, and I want to know this story is reaching people who understand that sometimes, the most ordinary places hide the most extraordinary secrets. If you've ever been dismissed because of your age, your gender, or because someone thought they knew better than you, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because this story is for everyone who's ever been underestimated. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why sometimes the best revenge comes from the most unexpected places. The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and disappointment. I sat there in my best black dress, the same one I'd worn to my husband Frank's funeral 3 weeks earlier, listening to words that might as well have been spoken in a foreign language. Frank had been gone for 21 days, and I was still reaching for his coffee cup every morning, still setting 2 plates out of habit. Thomas Morrison, Esquire, was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He'd been Frank's lawyer for 30 years, handling everything from our first house purchase to Frank's business dealings. I'd expected this meeting to be a formality, sign some papers, inherit our modest savings, maybe the house we'd lived in for 43 years. What I didn't expect was the bomb he was about to drop. "Mrs. Kowalski," he said, adjusting those glasses again, "your husband's will contain some unusual provisions." My son Danny sat beside me, fidgeting with his phone. At 45, he still acted like a teenager sometimes, and today was no exception. He'd driven down from Los Angeles in his expensive BMW, probably more concerned about getting back to his penthouse than spending time with his grieving mother. Danny had always been ambitious, but somewhere along the way, that ambition had hardened into something colder. "Just get to the point, Tom," Danny said without looking up from his screen. "Mom and I both know she's getting the house and whatever savings Dad managed to squirrel away. I've got meetings tomorrow." Mr. Morrison cleared his throat. "Actually, Daniel, it's more complicated than that." He opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. "Your father left very specific instructions about how his estate should be distributed." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Frank had always been straightforward about money. We'd discussed our wills years ago, or so I thought. What could possibly be complicated about leaving everything to your wife and only child? "The house," Mr. Morrison continued, "along with all liquid assets, investment accounts, and the vintage car collection, these go to Daniel." Danny's head snapped up from his phone. A smile spread across his face, the kind of smile I hadn't seen since he was a boy on Christmas morning. Well, I'll be damned. Dad really came through. But my heart was sinking. The house? Our house? The place where I'd raised Danny, where Frank and I had shared 4 decades of marriage. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. "However," Mr. Morrison said, and that single word hung in the air like a blade about to fall, "there is one additional bequest to Mrs. Kowalski." "What?" Danny asked, his voice sharp with sudden concern. "What else?" Mr. Morrison looked directly at me. "Dorothy, Frank left you his garage. The old service station on Maple Street." The room went dead silent. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, could hear Danny's breathing become shallow and quick. That garage. That old, run-down, barely-standing garage where Frank had spent his weekends for the last 10 years of his life. The place I'd begged him to sell dozens of times because it was nothing but a money pit. "You've got to be kidding me," Danny said, his voice rising. "That piece of crap building? Mom, that place is falling apart. The roof leaks, the foundation is shot, and it's in the worst part of town. Dad basically left you nothing." I stared at Mr. Morrison, trying to process what I'd just heard. Frank had left me the garage. Not our home, not our savings, not the classic cars he'd lovingly restored. A garage that probably wasn't worth the back taxes owed on it. "There's more," Mr. Morrison said quietly. "Frank left a letter for you, Dorothy. He insisted you read it before making any decisions about the property." He handed me an envelope with my name written in Frank's careful handwriting. My fingers trembled as I took it, and for a moment I could almost smell his aftershave, could almost hear his voice saying my name the way he had for 46 years of marriage. Danny leaned over, trying to see the letter. "What's it say, Mom?" I held the envelope close to my chest. Something told me this wasn't meant to be shared. Not yet. I'll read it later, honey. Later? Mom, we need to figure out what to do with that dump. I'm thinking we sell it as soon as possible. Use whatever money we can get to help with your living expenses. You'll need to find a smaller place anyway, now that the house is mine. Those words hit me like a physical blow. The house is mine. Not our family home or the place where you can stay as long as you want. The house is mine. My son, the boy I'd carried for 9 months, raised through every scraped knee and broken heart, supported through college and graduate school, had just made it clear that I was no longer welcome in my own home. Daniel, Mr. Morrison said carefully, there are some conditions attached to your inheritance. Danny's face went pale. What kind of conditions? Your mother must agree to the distribution. If she contests the will, everything goes into a trust that neither of you can touch for 5 years. I watched my son's face cycle through emotions, shock, anger, calculation. He looked at me with eyes that seemed like a stranger's. When had my sweet boy become this cold, grasping man? Mom, he said, and his voice had taken on that wheedling tone I remembered from his teenage years when he wanted something. You understand, right? Dad knew what he was doing. The house is worth almost $2 million now, and with the cars and investments, we're talking about serious money. That garage isn't worth anything. Dad probably just felt guilty about it and wanted to give you something. $2 million. I'd known our neighborhood had gotten expensive over the years, but hearing that number made my head spin. Frank had never talked about money in those terms. We'd lived simply, saved carefully, never put on airs. But apparently, we'd been sitting on a fortune. Mr. Morrison was watching me carefully. Mrs. Kowalski, you don't have to make any decisions today. Take some time to think about it. Read your husband's letter. If you have questions, you know how to reach me. I stood up on legs that felt like rubber. The envelope in my hands seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Thank you, Thomas. I think I need some air. Danny jumped up, suddenly solicitous. Mom, let me drive you home. We can talk about all this. Home. He was calling it home, but we both knew it wasn't my home anymore. Not really. The ride back to the house was quiet except for the hum of Danny's expensive car and the occasional ping of his phone receiving messages. I stared out the window at the neighborhood where I'd lived for most of my adult life. The tree Frank and I had planted when Danny started kindergarten was now massive, its branches reaching across the street. The house where the Millers had lived for 30 years now belonged to a young tech couple who'd painted it an aggressive shade of blue. Everything was changing, had been changing, and I'd been too focused on Frank's illness to notice. Mom, Danny said as we pulled into the driveway, I want you to know that just because the house is technically mine now doesn't mean anything has to change right away. You can stay as long as you need to get your bearings. As long as I needed to get my bearings. Like I was some confused old woman who needed time to understand my new reality. The condescension in his voice made something inside me harden. That's very generous of you, Danny, I said, not trying to hide the ice in my voice. He either didn't notice my tone or chose to ignore it. I'm thinking we could convert the garage apartment into a nice little space for you. Nothing fancy, but comfortable. Then we could rent out the main house, maybe use the income to help with your expenses. The garage apartment. A converted space above where we used to keep the lawn mower and Christmas decorations. He was talking about turning me into a tenant in my own home, and he was presenting it like he was doing me a favor. I got out of the car without saying goodbye and walked into the house. My house, for now, with Frank's letter clutched in my hand. Danny called after me, something about talking later, about not making any hasty decisions, but I wasn't listening anymore. Inside, the house felt different. It had felt different since Frank died, of course, but now it felt temporary. Like I was staying in a hotel where my reservation was about to expire. I walked through rooms where I'd raised my son, where Frank and I had celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, where we'd fought and made up and built a life together. All of it belonged to Danny now. I sat at the kitchen table where Frank and I had eaten thousands of meals together and carefully opened his letter. The handwriting was shakier than usual. He'd written this during those last weeks when the cancer was winning, but it was definitely his. Asterisk my dearest dot asterisk. Asterisk if you're reading this, then Tom has told you about the garage, and you're probably confused and maybe a little hurt. I need you to trust me, sweetheart. I need you to trust me one more time. Asterisk. I've been working on something in that garage for the past 2 years. Something I couldn't tell you about because I needed to be sure it would work. I know you think that place is worthless, but I promise you, it's not. There's something there that's going to change everything for you. I know giving the house to Danny seems cruel. I know it probably feels like I'm throwing you away after all these years. But our son has become someone we don't recognize. You've seen it too, even if you haven't wanted to admit it. The way he talks about money, the way he looks at people like they're opportunities instead of human beings. He needs to learn that money isn't everything, and I'm hoping this will teach him. But more than that, I needed to make sure you'd be okay without me. Really okay, not just scraping by on Social Security and whatever sympathy Danny might spare you. You deserve better than that, and what's in that garage is going to make sure you get it. Go to the garage. Go soon, before Danny starts pressuring you to sell it. And when you find what I left for you, remember that I loved you more than anything in this world, and I wanted to make sure you'd never have to depend on anyone else's charity. All my love, always. Frank. Pete. The key is where it's always been, behind the loose brick on the east wall. And don't tell Danny what you find until you've decided what to do with it. Trust me on this. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking more with each reading. Frank had been planning something. Working on something. For 2 years, while I thought he was just tinkering with old engines and avoiding dealing with his cancer diagnosis, he'd been, what? What could possibly be in that old garage that would change everything? Outside, I could hear Danny talking loudly on his phone, probably to his girlfriend Melissa or one of his business partners. He'd be flying back to Los Angeles tomorrow, back to his penthouse and his important meetings and his life that had no room for a grieving old woman. But tonight, I was going to that garage. The decision settled in my chest like a stone. Frank had asked me to trust him one more time. After 4 to 6 years of marriage, after all the times he'd been right when I thought he was wrong, after all the ways he'd taken care of me and protected me and loved me, I owed him that much. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my purse. Then I went upstairs to change clothes. If I was going to explore a rundown garage in the middle of the night, I needed better shoes. As I changed into jeans and sneakers, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. 72 years old, silver-haired, wearing clothes that Frank had watched me put on 1,000 times. I looked like exactly what Danny thought I was, a helpless old woman who needed to be managed and handled and eventually stored away somewhere convenient. But Frank hadn't seen me that way. Frank's letter suggested he thought I was someone who could handle whatever he'd left for me, someone strong enough to use it wisely. I was about to find out which one of them was right. The garage sat on Maple Street like a wounded animal, hunched and dark against the streetlights. I parked Frank's old pickup truck, the one Danny hadn't bothered to claim, in front of the building and sat there for a moment, staring at the place that had consumed so many of Frank's weekends over the past decade. It was just past midnight, and the neighborhood was quiet except for the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. This part of town had seen better days. Most of the businesses had moved out to the newer shopping centers, leaving behind empty storefronts and cracked sidewalks. Frank's garage fit right in with its peeling paint and sagging roofline. I'd been here exactly twice in the last 10 years. Once when Frank first bought the place, dragging me along to see his investment opportunity, and once about 5 years ago when he'd insisted on showing me some work he'd done on the electrical system. Both times, I'd seen nothing but an old building that needed more money than we had to spend. But tonight, holding his letter in my purse and thinking about the way Danny had dismissed me like yesterday's newspaper, I was seeing it through different eyes. The key was exactly where Frank said it would be, behind the third loose brick from the corner. He'd showed me that hiding spot years ago, back when he'd been excited about having his own workspace. I'd forgotten about it until tonight, but my fingers found the brick and the key as if no time had passed at all. The lock was newer than I expected, and it turned easily. Frank had been maintaining this place better than its appearance suggested. The metal door creaked as it opened, and I fumbled along the wall for the light switch, trying to remember where it was located. When the fluorescent lights flickered on, I gasped. This wasn't the same garage I'd visited 5 years ago. That space had been cluttered and chaotic, filled with engine parts and old furniture and boxes of junk that Frank insisted he'd need someday. This was organized, professional, clean. The concrete floor had been painted a glossy gray, and every tool had its place on pegboards that lined the walls. 3 classic cars sat under cloth covers, their shapes elegant even in hiding. Workbenches ran along 2 walls, equipped with tools I didn't recognize and machinery that looked expensive and new. But what caught my attention was the back corner of the garage, where a partition wall had been built that hadn't been there before. It was painted the same industrial grey as the floor, with a solid door marked private in Frank's careful lettering. I walked toward that door on legs that felt unsteady. The garage was bigger than I'd remembered, and my footsteps echoed off the high ceiling. Everything about this place spoke of careful planning and significant investment. This wasn't the hobby workshop of a man killing time until retirement. This was something else entirely. The door to the partitioned area was locked, but there was another key on Frank's ring, smaller and newer than the others. It fit perfectly. The room beyond was like stepping into a different world. It was an office, but not like any office I'd ever seen. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, and a massive desk dominated the center of the room. But it was the walls that made my breath catch in my throat. They were covered with photographs, documents, maps, and what looked like surveillance notes. String connected various points like something out of a detective movie. And at the center of it all, like the spider in a web, was a photograph of a man I'd never seen before but somehow knew was important. On the desk was a manila folder with my name written on it in Frank's handwriting. Next to it was a newer-looking laptop computer and a small digital camera. My hands trembled as I opened the folder. The first document was a letter addressed to me, but longer and more formal than the one I'd found at the lawyer's office. Asterisk. If you're reading this, you found my real workshop. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about this while I was alive, but I needed to protect you from what I was doing until I was sure it would work. For the past 3 years, I've been investigating a man named Marcus Hendricks. He's a real estate developer here in town, and he's also a criminal. He's been running a money laundering operation through his construction company, and he's destroyed a lot of people's lives in the process. You remember the Kowalski family that used to live on Oak Street? Old Walter Kowalski, no relation, just the same name, lost his house when Hendricks bought his mortgage from the bank and foreclosed immediately. The Patels who owned the corner grocery? Hendricks bought their building and tripled their rent overnight. The Johnsons who lost their landscaping business when Hendricks reported them to ICE even though they were legal residents. Hendricks has been systematically destroying this neighborhood, buying up properties cheap after he's ruined the previous owners, then selling them to his money laundering operation for inflated prices. The dirty money gets clean, and families get destroyed. I've been documenting everything. Every dirty deal, every forged document, every bribed city official. It's all here, and it's enough to put him away for the rest of his life. But here's the thing I discovered 6 months ago, sweetheart. Hendricks has been trying to buy our house. He's been working with Danny. I stopped reading and had to sit down. Danny? My Danny was working with a criminal? Danny doesn't know Hendricks is a criminal. At least I don't think he does. But he's been feeding Hendricks information about our finances, our health, our plans for the future. Hendricks has been waiting for me to die so he could approach Danny about selling the house. They've already discussed price ranges. I confronted Danny about this 2 months ago. I didn't tell him about my investigation, just asked him about his contact with Hendricks. He lied to my face. Our son looked me in the eye and lied to me about making deals behind our backs. That's when I changed my will. I realized that Danny had become someone who would sell out his own family for money, and I couldn't let that happen to you. Everything you need to destroy Hendricks is in these files. Bank records, photographs, recorded conversations, witness statements. I've been working with a FBI agent named Sarah Chen. Her card is in the folder. She's been waiting for me to gather enough evidence for an airtight case. This is bigger than just Hendricks. The files will show you that his operation is worth millions of dollars. Under federal law, when a criminal organization is seized, there's a reward fund for people who provide information leading to conviction. We're talking about enough money to buy 10 houses like ours. I didn't want to tell you about this while I was alive because I was afraid something might happen to you if Hendricks found out what I was doing. But now that I'm gone, you have all the power. You have the evidence, you have the contacts, and you have every legal right to claim that reward. Danny thinks he's inheriting a fortune, but what he's really inheriting is an empty house that Hendrix will sweet-talk him out of for a fraction of its value. You, my darling, are inheriting the power to make sure that never happens. Asterisk. Asterisk. The choice is yours. You can turn this evidence over to Agent Chen and let justice run its course, or you can use what I've discovered for your own purposes. Either way, you'll never have to worry about money again, and you'll never have to depend on Danny's charity. Asterisk. Asterisk. There's one more thing, sweetheart. Look in the safe. Asterisk. The safe was hidden behind a filing cabinet that rolled away on smooth casters. It was a small but expensive-looking unit with a digital lock. The combination was written on a slip of paper taped to the back of Frank's letter, our wedding anniversary. Inside the safe were more documents, but also something that made my knees go weak, stacks of cash. Lots of cash. Another note from Frank explained, asterisk. This is money I skimmed from Hendrix's operation over the past year. Call it an advance on your reward. There's $50,000 here, all clean and untraceable. Use it however you want. Asterisk. I sat in Frank's office chair, surrounded by evidence of crimes I'd never imagined, holding more cash than I'd seen in my entire life. My husband, the man who'd worried about spending $20 on a dinner out, had been running a one-man investigation into organized crime. And he'd been stealing from criminals to make sure I'd be taken care of after he was gone. The laptop computer was password protected, but Frank had left me that information too. When I opened it, I found hundreds of files, photographs, and what looked like accounting spreadsheets that tracked money moving through dozens of fake companies. There were photos of Danny meeting with Marcus Hendrix at expensive restaurants. Photos of Danny showing Hendrix documents that looked like copies of our financial records. Photos of handshakes and exchanged envelopes and meetings in parking garages. My son, the boy I'd raised to believe in honesty and hard work, was planning to sell our family home to a criminal. And he'd been planning it for months, maybe years, waiting for his father to die. I closed the laptop and looked around the office Frank had built in secret. Every piece of evidence was labeled and organized. Every photograph was dated and cross-referenced. Every document was photocopied and stored in multiple locations. Frank had built a case that would destroy Marcus Hendrix and everyone connected to him, including, potentially, Danny. Agent Chen's business card was exactly where Frank said it would be. Sarah Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Her phone number was written in Frank's handwriting on the back, along with a note, asterisk expecting your call. Frank told me everything. Asterisk. So Frank's FBI contact knew about me. Knew I might be calling someday. Knew there was a widow who might need their help bringing down a criminal organization. I looked at my watch. It was almost 2 in the morning, too late to call anyone. But tomorrow, I would have decisions to make. Big decisions that would affect the rest of my life and possibly destroy my son's future. Frank had left me the power to choose, justice or family, evidence or mercy, the security that comes with doing the right thing, or the heartbreak that comes with protecting someone who might not deserve protection. But tonight, I was too overwhelmed to think clearly. I needed to go home and process what I'd learned. I needed to figure out how the man I'd been married to for 46 years had become someone I didn't recognize. And I needed to decide whether the son I'd raised was worth saving from himself. I locked up the files, turned off the lights, and drove home through empty streets. The house was dark when I got there. Danny had either gone to bed or gone out, and I was grateful for the solitude. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed Frank and I had shared for 4 decades and tried to make sense of the night's discoveries. My husband had been a secret investigator. My son was collaborating with criminals. And I was apparently the beneficiary of the most unusual inheritance in history, the power to destroy lives or change them forever. Frank's last gift to me wasn't just financial security. It was the choice to decide what kind of person I wanted to be in the final chapters of my own story. The question was, what was I going to do with that choice? I barely slept that night, my mind racing with everything I'd discovered in Frank's secret office. When I finally drifted off around dawn, I dreamed of photographs and file folders, of handshakes between my son and strangers, of Frank sitting in that office chair making notes about crimes I couldn't have imagined. I woke up at 9 to the smell of coffee and the sound of Danny moving around downstairs. For a moment, I forgot everything that had happened and felt a brief flutter of happiness. My boy was making breakfast, just like when he was young and would surprise me with burned toast and over-scrambled eggs on Mother's Day. Then reality came crashing back. Danny wasn't my sweet little boy anymore. According to Frank's evidence, He was a man who would sell out his own family for money. I put on my robe and went downstairs to find Danny at the kitchen table with his laptop open, papers spread around him, and 2 cups of coffee waiting. He looked up when I entered and gave me that smile that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. "Morning, Mom. I thought we should go over some numbers together, figure out the best way to handle your situation." My situation. Like I was a problem that needed solving instead of his mother who was still grieving the loss of her husband. "I made coffee," he continued, pushing one of the cups toward me. "It's that fancy stuff you like from the coffee shop downtown. I picked it up yesterday." I sat down across from him and wrapped my hands around the warm cup. Danny had dressed carefully for this conversation. Khakis, button-down shirt, looking every inch the successful businessman he'd become. But I was seeing him differently now, looking for signs of the man Frank had described in his files. "So," Danny said, consulting a yellow legal pad covered with his handwriting, "I've been crunching some numbers, and I think I've figured out the best solution for everyone." "I'm listening," I said quietly. "Okay, so the garage." He wrinkled his nose like he was discussing something distasteful. "I did some research last night, and that part of town is pretty much worthless. Property values have been dropping for years, and most of the buildings are condemned or close to it. But I found a guy who specializes in buying up old commercial properties for demolition." He turned his laptop toward me, showing me a website for something called Hendricks Development Corporation. My blood went cold, but I kept my expression neutral. "This guy Marcus Hendricks has been revitalizing that whole area," Danny continued, completely oblivious to my reaction. "He's been buying up all the old buildings, tearing them down, and putting in modern commercial spaces. Shopping centers, office buildings, that kind of thing. He's interested in Dad's garage." "You've talked to him?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, actually. I reached out to him yesterday afternoon, sent him some photos of the property, tax records, that kind of thing. He's very interested. Says he can make us an offer by this afternoon." Danny had contacted Hendricks within hours of learning about the inheritance. Not to comfort his grieving mother, not to honor his father's memory, but to make a deal with the exact man Frank had been investigating. "How did you know to contact him specifically?" I asked. "Oh, we've been in touch for a while," Danny said casually, not realizing he'd just confirmed everything in Frank's files. "He's been interested in the neighborhood for months. Really impressive guy, actually. Started with nothing and built a huge business. Real American success story." I sipped my coffee and studied my son's face. He was excited, animated in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child. But it wasn't the joy of someone helping his family. It was the excitement of someone who smelled money. "What kind of offer do you think he'll make?" I asked. "Well, that's the thing. The garage itself isn't worth much, maybe $20,000 or $30,000. But Hendricks explained that these development deals work better when he can buy multiple properties at once. He's been trying to acquire the whole block." Danny leaned forward conspiratorially. "Here's where it gets interesting, Mom. Hendricks is willing to pay premium prices for properties that help him complete his development plans. He hinted that he might go as high as $100,000 for the garage." $100,000. To most people, that would seem like a fortune. But after seeing Frank's files, I knew it was probably a fraction of what the property was really worth to Hendricks' money laundering operation. "That sounds too good to be true," I said. "That's what I thought at first. But Hendricks explained how these development deals work. He makes money on the big picture, the shopping centers and office buildings he puts up after demolition. Paying a little extra for the individual properties is just part of his business model." Danny was repeating Hendricks' sales pitch almost word for word, probably not realizing how naive he sounded. Or maybe he didn't care, as long as he got his cut of the money. "There's just one small complication," Danny continued, and something in his tone made me pay closer attention. "Hendricks prefers to deal with a single owner when he's buying property. Having to negotiate with multiple heirs can slow down the whole process." "What are you suggesting?" "Well, technically, you inherited the garage. But Mom, let's be realistic. You don't know anything about real estate or business negotiations. And you're dealing with a lot right now, with Dad's death and adjusting to living on your own." He reached across the table and patted my hand like I was a confused child. "I think the smart move would be for you to sign the garage over to me. Let me handle the sale to Hendricks. We'll split the money 50-50, but I'll take care of all the paperwork and negotiations. That way, you don't have to worry about any of the business details. There it was. Danny wanted me to sign over the property so he could sell it to Hendricks without any interference from me. According to Frank's files, this was probably the plan they'd worked out months ago. 50-50 seems fair, I said mildly, but I'm curious about something. You said you and this Hendricks fellow have been in touch for a while. How did that start? For just a moment, Danny's smooth confidence flickered. Oh, you know how these things work. Business networking. I think someone might have referred him to me, or maybe I met him at a Chamber of Commerce event. He was lying, and not very well. I could see him calculating how much to tell me, trying to figure out what I might already know. Danny, I said softly, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. Of course, Mom. You can ask me anything. Have you been sharing information about our family finances with Marcus Hendricks? The question hit him like a physical blow. His face went pale, and he sat back in his chair as if I'd slapped him. What? No, of course not. Why would you? Where did that come from? But his eyes were darting around the room, and his hands had started to tremble slightly. All the tells I'd learned to recognize when he was a teenager trying to lie his way out of trouble. Danny, I know you've been meeting with him. I know you've shown him documents about our finances. I know you've been planning this for months, waiting for your father to die so you could move forward with whatever deal you've worked out. He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched his expression cycle through shock, anger, and finally calculation. Mom, where are you getting this information? Who's been talking to you? Does it matter? Is it true? He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make thousands of times when he was stressed. When he looked at me again, the mask had slipped completely. The successful businessman was gone, replaced by someone desperate and cornered. Okay, yes. I've been talking to Hendricks about Dad's properties. But Mom, it's not what you think. I was trying to help the family. Do you have any idea how much money we're sitting on? Tell me. The house alone is worth $2 million, maybe more. Dad's car collection could bring in another $500,000 if we sell to the right collectors. And there are investment accounts I didn't even know about until yesterday. We're talking about serious money, Mom. Life-changing money. And you thought you should handle all of this without telling me or your father. Dad was sick. Danny's voice was rising, taking on a whining quality I remembered from his childhood tantrums. He wasn't thinking clearly about business decisions. And you. Mom, no offense, but you've never dealt with this kind of money before. I was trying to protect both of you from making mistakes. By making deals behind our backs with a man you barely know. Hendricks isn't just some random guy. He's a legitimate businessman with major development projects all over the state. Working with him could set our family up for generations. I stood up from the table, unable to sit still any longer. Danny was still talking, still trying to justify what he'd done, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heart breaking. This was my son. The baby I'd rocked to sleep, the little boy who'd brought me dandelions and called them flowers, the teenager who'd cried in my arms when his first girlfriend broke his heart. And he'd become someone who would lie to his dying father and manipulate his grieving mother for money. Mom, you have to understand, Danny was saying, I was trying to help. I was trying to make sure you'd be taken care of. I turned to look at him. By cutting me out of decisions about my own life? By working with strangers to sell property that doesn't belong to you? By lying to your father's face while he was dying of cancer? I never meant for it to go that far, Danny said, his voice breaking slightly. Dad confronted me about Hendricks 2 months ago. I should have told him everything then, but I was afraid he'd cut me out of the will completely. So you lied to him? Yes. I lied. But Mom, I was scared. Dad was so sick, and I didn't know how much time he had left, and I thought if I could just get everything set up properly, we'd all be better off in the end. I looked at this man who used to be my little boy, and I felt something inside me die. Not the explosive death that comes with sudden tragedy, but the slow, cold death that comes with profound disappointment. Danny, I said quietly, I want you to leave. What? Mom, no. We need to figure this out together. We need to. I want you to pack your things and go back to Los Angeles. Today. You can't be serious. Mom, I'm your son. We're family. We can work through this. Are we family? I asked. Because family members don't lie to each other while their father is dying. Family members don't make deals to sell their mother's inheritance without telling her. Family members don't treat each other like obstacles to be managed. Danny's face was cycling through emotions, but what I saw most clearly was panic. The panic of someone who'd overplayed his hand and was watching his carefully laid plans fall apart. Mom, you're being emotional. I get it, you're still grieving, you're not thinking clearly. But we can't let our feelings interfere with making smart financial decisions. That was the final straw. My son was telling me I was too emotional and stupid to handle my own affairs. Just like he'd been telling Hendrix, probably for months. Get out, I said, my voice steady and cold. Get out of my house. Get out right now. Your house. Danny's voice turned sharp, angry. Mom, this is my house. According to Dad's will, this is legally my property. You're living here at my discretion. There it was. The truth he'd been hiding behind his fake concern and manipulative kindness. I wasn't his mother anymore. I was a tenant he was tolerating. You're right, I said calmly. This is your house. So I'll leave. What? No, Mom, that's not what I meant. I want you to stay. We just need to establish some ground rules about how decisions get made. Ground rules, I repeated. In my own home. In my home, he corrected, and I could see him realizing too late how that sounded. Mom, look, we're both saying things we don't mean. Why don't we take a break, cool off, and talk about this tonight? There's nothing to talk about, Danny. You've made it very clear how you see our relationship now. You've made it very clear what I am to you. I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up my purse. Frank's letter was still inside, along with the keys to the garage and the truck. Everything I needed to walk away from this conversation and this house and this son who'd become a stranger. Where are you going? Danny asked, following me toward the door. That's not your concern anymore. Mom, be reasonable. You can't just leave. Where are you going to stay? You don't have anywhere to go. I turned to look at him one more time. Danny, you've spent this entire conversation trying to convince me that I'm too old, too stupid, and too emotional to handle my own life. But you're wrong about one thing. I do have somewhere to go. I have the garage your father left me. The garage you think is worthless. You can't be serious. Mom, that place is a dump. It doesn't even have running water or heat. You can't live there. Watch me. I walked out the door and got into Frank's pickup truck, leaving Danny standing on the front porch calling after me. As I drove away, I could see him in the rearview mirror, his phone already pressed to his ear. Probably calling Hendrix to tell him there'd been a complication with their plans. But they had no idea what kind of complication they were dealing with. I drove to the garage with my mind racing. Danny thought he'd inherited a fortune and left me with nothing. He thought I was a helpless old woman who would eventually come crawling back to accept whatever crumbs he was willing to offer. What he didn't know was that I'd inherited something far more valuable than money. The power to destroy the man he'd been planning to do business with, and the evidence to prove that Danny himself might be an accessory to multiple felonies. As I pulled up in front of the garage, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to call FBI agent Chen right away. I wasn't going to turn over Frank's evidence and let the federal government handle Marcus Hendrix. First, I was going to handle Danny. I was going to let him proceed with his plan to sell the garage to Hendrix. I was going to let him think he'd won, that he'd successfully manipulated his foolish old mother into accepting his generous offer to split the proceeds. And then, when he'd committed himself completely to a business relationship with a man who laundered money and destroyed families, I was going to destroy them both. If Danny wanted to treat me like I was worthless, I was going to show him exactly how much this worthless old woman was capable of. The garage looked different in daylight. Still run down and shabby from the outside, but I could see signs of Frank's improvements that I'd missed before. New gutters, a recently repaired foundation, windows that had been replaced with energy-efficient models. Frank hadn't just been using this place as a workshop. He'd been preparing it for something. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, breathing in the smell of motor oil and metal polish and something else I couldn't identify. This was going to be my home now, at least temporarily. This rundown garage in the worst part of town was going to be my base of operations while I figured out how to use Frank's final gift. My phone buzzed with a text message from Danny. "Mom, I'm sorry. I handled that badly. Come home and we'll talk." I deleted the message without responding. Let him worry. Let him wonder what I was planning. Let him call Hendrix and explain that his mother was being difficult. Because I was about to become more difficult than either of them could possibly imagine. I walked to the back of the garage, to Frank's secret office, and unlocked the door. All of his evidence was still there, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. Bank records and photographs and witness statements that could send Marcus Hendrix to prison for the rest of his life. But first, I was going to let my son dig his own grave a little deeper. I pulled out Agent Chen's business card and stared at it for a long moment. Then I put it back in the folder and closed the drawer. Not yet. Not until Danny had committed himself so completely to Hendrix's criminal operation that there would be no way for him to claim innocence when everything came crashing down. Frank had trusted me to choose between justice and family. What he might not have anticipated was that sometimes, justice and family were the same thing. Sometimes, the only way to save someone you love is to destroy them first. 3 days passed before Danny called. 3 days during which I'd been living in Frank's garage, sleeping on an air mattress I'd bought at the discount store, eating takeout from the diner down the street, and planning my revenge. The garage wasn't as uncomfortable as Danny had predicted. Frank had installed a small bathroom with a shower in the back corner, hidden behind the partition wall that held his office. There was a mini refrigerator, a hot plate, and even a small TV that got decent reception. It wasn't luxury, but it was livable, and more importantly, it was mine. During those 3 days, I'd studied every file in Frank's collection. I'd memorized bank account numbers, traced money through shell companies, and learned more about criminal enterprise than I'd ever wanted to know. I'd also discovered something that made my blood run cold. Hendrix wasn't just laundering money through real estate deals. He was also involved in insurance fraud, tax evasion, and what looked like extortion. The families he'd destroyed weren't just collateral damage in his business dealings. They were deliberately targeted victims, chosen because their financial troubles made them vulnerable to his schemes. But the most shocking discovery was how long Danny had been involved. The earliest photographs Frank had taken showed Danny meeting with Hendrix almost 2 years ago, long before Frank's cancer diagnosis. This wasn't a recent development born out of desperation. This was a long-term business relationship that Danny had been hiding from his family. When my phone finally rang, I almost didn't answer it. But I needed to know what Danny was planning, and more importantly, I needed him to believe he was still in control. "Mom," Danny's voice was careful, contrite. "I've been worried sick about you. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Danny. Look, I know I said some things the other day that came out wrong. I was stressed about the whole inheritance situation, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair." I waited, saying nothing. Let him fill the silence. "The thing is, I've been thinking about what you said, about making decisions together as a family. You're right. I should have talked to you and Dad before reaching out to Hendrix. I was trying to help, but I went about it the wrong way." Still nothing from me. I could almost hear him sweating through the phone. "So here's what I'm thinking," he continued. "Why don't you come back to the house, and we'll approach this whole garage situation as equal partners. 50-50 on everything, and you have veto power over any deal I try to make." It was a good offer, probably more generous than he wanted to be. But it was also exactly what I'd been expecting. Danny needed my signature on the sale documents, which meant he needed to get me back under his influence. "That sounds reasonable," I said finally. I could hear the relief in his voice. Great, Mom. I knew we could work this out. When do you want to come home?" "Actually, Danny, I've been thinking too. And I've decided I like living in the garage." "What? Mom, you can't be serious. It's not safe for you to be living down there by yourself." "I'm perfectly safe. And I'm enjoying the independence." But how are we supposed to work together if you're living in a garage across town?" "You could come visit me," I suggested. "In fact, why don't you bring Mr. Hendrix by tomorrow afternoon? I'd like to meet this businessman you think so highly of." There was a long pause. "You want to meet Hendrix?" "Well, if I'm going to sell him my property, I should probably know who I'm dealing with, don't you think?" "Of course, absolutely. That's very smart, Mom. Very businesslike." He was trying to figure out what game I was playing, but he couldn't afford to refuse. He needed this deal too badly. How about 2 o'clock tomorrow? I suggested. That will give me time to clean up the place a little bit. Perfect. Mom, I think you're going to like Marcus. He's a real straight shooter, very professional. A straight shooter. If Danny only knew what kind of shooting Hendrix specialized in. After I hung up, I spent the evening preparing for tomorrow's performance. I moved some of Frank's tools around to make the garage look more like what Hendrix would expect. Cluttered, disorganized, the workshop of a man who'd died before he could finish his projects. I hid all evidence of Frank's investigation behind locked doors and made sure nothing looked too valuable or well-maintained. Most importantly, I practiced looking like a lonely, confused old widow who was grateful for her son's help with complicated business matters. The next day, I watched from the office window as Danny's BMW pulled up outside, followed by a black Mercedes that probably cost more than most people's houses. Marcus Hendrix stepped out of the Mercedes, and I got my first good look at the man who'd been destroying my neighborhood. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 55, with silver hair and an expensive suit. Handsome in the way that successful criminals often are, confident, charming, dangerous. He moved with the easy assurance of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. I unlocked the front door and met them halfway, letting Danny handle the introductions. Mom, I'd like you to meet Marcus Hendrix. Marcus, this is my mother, Dorothy Kowalski. Hendrix stepped forward with a smile that was probably designed to be reassuring but looked predatory to my eyes. Mrs. Kowalski, I'm so sorry for your loss. Danny's told me wonderful things about you and your late husband. He took my hand in both of his, the gesture of someone practiced at manipulating elderly people. His hands were soft, manicured, the hands of a man who'd never done honest work in his life. Thank you, Mr. Hendrix. Danny says you're interested in buying my little garage. Please, call me Marcus. And yes, I'm very interested. I've been working to revitalize this entire neighborhood, and your property would be a key piece in that development. I led them into the main garage area, watching Hendrix's eyes catalog everything. The covered cars, the expensive tools, the evidence of Frank's mechanical skills. Your husband was quite the craftsman, Hendrix said, walking over to one of the covered vehicles. Would you mind if I took a look? Go ahead, I said, even though every instinct was screaming at me not to let this criminal put his hands on Frank's work. Hendrix pulled back the car cover to reveal a pristine 1967 Mustang convertible, restored to showroom condition. Even Danny whistled appreciatively. This is museum-quality work, Hendrix said, running his hand along the car's flawless paint job. Your husband had real talent. I hate to see craftsmanship like this go to waste. What do you mean? I asked, though I was pretty sure I knew. Well, obviously, these cars will need to be sold before we can proceed with the demolition. I have contacts in the classic car market. I'd be happy to handle that for you, make sure you get fair market value. Of course he would. He'd probably sell Frank's cars to his money-laundering contacts for a fraction of their worth, then pocket the difference. That's very generous of you, I said. But I haven't decided to sell yet. I'm still considering my options. Danny shot me a warning look. This wasn't part of the script we'd discussed. Of course, Hendrix said smoothly. It's a big decision. But Mrs. Kowalski, can I speak frankly? Please do. This neighborhood is changing rapidly. Property values are going to continue declining unless someone invests in major development. If you wait too long to sell, you might find that your property is worth significantly less than it is today. It was a threat wrapped in business advice. Sell now, or watch your investment become worthless. How much less? I asked, playing the worried widow. It's hard to say. The city has been talking about condemning some of the older buildings in this area. If that happens, property owners might be forced to sell at assessed value, which is usually much lower than market value. Another lie. I checked with the city planning office yesterday. There were no condemnation proceedings planned for this neighborhood. That sounds scary, I said, widening my eyes like the helpless old woman he thought I was. It doesn't have to be, Hendrix said, his voice taking on a paternal tone. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer, well above market value, to help you avoid any potential problems. How generous? Hendrix glanced at Danny, who nodded almost imperceptibly. $150,000, Hendrix said. Cash, with a quick closing. You could have the money in your account within 2 weeks. 150,000. More than Danny had originally mentioned, but still probably a fraction of what the property was worth to Hendrik's operation. That does sound generous, I admitted. But I'm curious about something, Marcus. May I ask what you plan to do with the property after you buy it? Mixed-use development, he said without hesitation. Retail on the ground floor, office space above. It's part of a larger vision to bring jobs and commerce back to this area. More lies. According to Frank's files, Hendrik's developments were usually just fronts for moving dirty money. The buildings got constructed with inflated budgets using laundered funds, then sold to shell companies at artificial prices. That sounds wonderful, I said. This neighborhood could use more jobs. Exactly. Mrs. Kowalski, I think your husband would have appreciated what I'm trying to do here. From what Danny's told me, Frank was a man who believed in hard work and community improvement. The casual mention of Frank's name, the pretense that this criminal cared about my dead husband's values, made something snap inside me. But I kept my expression neutral, even managed to look touched by his words. Frank would have liked you, I said, the lie tasting like poison in my mouth. I hope so. Mrs. Kowalski, I don't want to pressure you, but I do have other properties I'm looking at. If you're interested in my offer, I'd need to know soon. Another threat. Take the deal now or lose the opportunity. How soon? Could you let me know by Friday? That would give me time to have my lawyers draw up the contracts over the weekend. It was Tuesday. He was giving me 3 days to decide whether to sell my property to a criminal for a fraction of its worth. That seems reasonable, I said. But I do have one condition. Both men looked at me expectantly. I'd like to see some examples of your previous development projects. If I'm going to sell to you, I want to make sure you're the kind of businessman who keeps his promises. Hendrik's smile faltered for just a moment, so briefly that most people would have missed it. But I was watching for exactly that reaction. Of course, he said. I'd be happy to show you some of my work. Danny has my contact information. Why don't you give me a call tomorrow, and we can arrange a tour? I'd like that very much. We shook hands again, and I walked them to the door. As they reached their cars, I heard Hendrik say something to Danny in a low voice. Danny glanced back at me, then nodded. They were already planning their next move, probably discussing how to handle the eccentric old woman who wanted to see proof of Hendrik's legitimate business activities. What they didn't know was that I'd just bought myself access to Hendrik's operation. Tomorrow, I was going to see firsthand how his money laundering scheme worked. I was going to gather evidence that even Frank hadn't been able to collect. And then, when I had everything I needed to destroy both Hendrik's and my son's involvement with him, I was going to make them pay for every family they'd ruined, every life they'd destroyed, and every lie they'd told. The trap was set. All I had to do now was spring it. Marcus Hendricks picked me up at precisely 10 o'clock the next morning in his black Mercedes. He'd dressed down for the occasion, khakis instead of a suit, polo shirt instead of dress shirt, probably trying to seem more approachable to the elderly widow he was planning to swindle. I'd dressed up for the occasion myself, wearing my best church outfit and the pearl necklace Frank had given me for our 40th anniversary. I wanted to look like exactly what Hendricks expected, a well-meaning but naive old woman who could be impressed by a smooth-talking businessman. I thought we'd start with my newest project, Hendricks said as we drove through downtown. It's a mixed-use development about 10 minutes from your garage. Really shows what's possible when you have the right vision for urban renewal. The building he showed me first was impressive, I had to admit. A gleaming 4-story structure with retail spaces on the ground floor and what looked like expensive condominiums above. A sign in front advertised luxury living in the heart of downtown with prices starting at $500,000. This used to be a crack house, Hendricks said as we stood on the sidewalk admiring his handiwork. The whole block was a disaster zone 5 years ago. Drug dealers, prostitutes, homeless camps. Now look at it. He gestured proudly at the manicured landscaping and clean sidewalks. It was genuinely transformative, and for a moment I almost understood why Danny had been impressed. How did you afford to do all this? I asked innocently. Smart financing, Hendricks said. I work with private investors who understand the long-term value of urban development. They're willing to put up the initial capital because they know the return on investment will be substantial. Private investors. According to Frank's files, those private investors were actually money launderers looking for ways to clean their cash through legitimate-seeming construction projects. The key, Hendricks continued as we walked around the building, is buying the right properties at the right price. Most developers try to lowball everyone, but I believe in paying fair market value. It builds trust in the community. Fair market value. I'd seen the purchase records in Frank's files. Hendricks had bought the properties for this development at prices so low they couldn't possibly have been voluntary sales. Most likely, he'd used his usual tactics, financial pressure, legal threats, and bureaucratic manipulation to force people to sell. What happened to the people who used to live here? I asked. Most of them were renters, so they just moved on to other neighborhoods. The few property owners were happy to sell and relocate somewhere more suitable to their needs. Happy to sell. Right. Just like the Patels had been happy to sell their grocery store after Hendricks tripled their rent overnight. We spent the next hour touring 3 more of Hendricks' developments. Each one told the same story, a formerly troubled neighborhood transformed into upscale commercial and residential space. And each one raised the same questions about where the money had come from and what had happened to the original residents. But I played my role perfectly, asking the kinds of questions a genuinely impressed elderly woman might ask. How long did the construction take? Where did he find such skilled contractors? How did he know what kinds of businesses would succeed in each location? Hendricks was clearly enjoying himself, warming to the subject of his own success. By the time we stopped for lunch at an expensive restaurant downtown, he was treating me like a favorite aunt, someone who appreciated his vision and admired his accomplishments. You know, Dorothy, may I call you Dorothy? You remind me of my own mother, he said over our salads. She had the same kind of practical intelligence, the same ability to see the big picture. What happened to her? I asked. Cancer, about 10 years ago. She was a remarkable woman. Built her own business from nothing, raised 3 kids as a single mother after my father left. She taught me everything I know about recognizing opportunities and taking calculated risks. The personal revelation was probably designed to build rapport, to make me feel special and trusted. But all it did was make me angry. This man was using his dead mother's memory to manipulate me, the same way he'd probably used it to manipulate dozens of other victims. She sounds wonderful, I said. I'm sure she'd be proud of what you've accomplished. I hope so. Dorothy, can I tell you something? I nodded, leaning forward like I was eager to hear his confession. When Danny first contacted me about your property, I was interested purely from a business perspective. But after meeting you yesterday, after spending this morning with you, I realize this is about more than just real estate. What do you mean? I see a lot of myself in Danny. Ambitious, driven, maybe a little impatient sometimes. And I see a lot of my mother in you. Strong, practical, concerned about family. I want to make sure this deal works out well for both of you. He reached across the table and patted my hand, the same condescending gesture Danny had used a few days earlier. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realize I may have seemed like I was rushing you. That wasn't fair. This is a big decision, and you should take all the time you need to feel comfortable with it. That's very considerate of you, Marcus. Here's what I'm thinking. Instead of waiting until Friday for your answer, why don't we extend the deadline? Take a couple of weeks, talk it over with Danny. Maybe get some independent advice about the value of your property. I want you to be completely confident that you're making the right choice. It was a good move, calculated to make me trust him even more. The high-pressure businessman backing off, showing respect for my concerns, proving that he cared about my well-being more than his own profit. But I could see through it now. This was exactly how he'd manipulated all his other victims. Make them feel special, build personal relationships, earn their trust, then use that trust to convince them to make decisions against their own interests. That's very generous, I said. But actually, I think I've already made up my mind. Hendricks went very still. Oh. I've decided to accept your offer. $150,000, cash, quick closing. The relief on his face was unmistakable, though he tried to hide it behind professional composure. Dorothy, that's wonderful. I'm so pleased we can work together on this. There's just one small thing, I added. What's that? I'd like to include the cars in the sale. Frank's collection. You mentioned yesterday that you had contacts in the classic car market, and I really don't know anything about selling them myself. Hendricks' eyes lit up. He'd been hoping I'd ask about the cars, probably planning to lowball me on their value while selling them for 10 times what he paid me. Of course. I'd be happy to handle that for you. Based on what I saw yesterday, I'd estimate the collection is worth about $50,000. I could add that to the property sale price, make it an even $200,000 for everything. $50,000. According to the insurance records I'd found in Frank's files, those cars were worth at least $300,000, possibly more. Hendricks was planning to steal $250,000 from me while pretending to do me a favor. That sounds perfect, I said, giving him my most grateful smile. Excellent. I'll have my lawyer draw up the contracts this afternoon. We could potentially close early next week if you're ready to move that quickly. The sooner the better. I'm looking forward to having this settled. We shook hands across the table, sealing what Hendricks thought was the deal of a lifetime. A $200,000 purchase that he'd probably flip to his money laundering contacts for over $1 million, plus $300,000 worth of classic cars that he'd gotten for a sixth of their value. But what Hendricks didn't know was that he'd just agreed to buy property from someone who had enough evidence to send him to prison for the rest of his life. Property that he'd never actually own, cars that he'd never get to sell, and a deal that was going to destroy everything he'd spent years building. As he drove me back to the garage, Hendricks was practically glowing with satisfaction. He'd closed another deal with another gullible victim. In his mind, he'd just added another property to his criminal empire and made another small fortune in the process. Dorothy, he said as we pulled up in front of the garage, I want you to know how much I've enjoyed getting to know you today. It's been a real pleasure doing business with someone who appreciates quality and understands the value of opportunity. The pleasure has been all mine, Marcus. You've been so patient with all my questions. Not at all. I respect the fact that you wanted to understand what you were getting into. That shows real wisdom. I got out of the car and waved goodbye as he drove away, probably heading straight to his lawyer's office to draw up the contracts for the biggest mistake of his criminal career. Once he was out of sight, I went into the garage and straight to Frank's office. I had work to do. Phone calls to make, evidence to organize, and a plan to finalize. First, I called FBI agent Sarah Chen. Agent Chen, this is Dorothy Kowalski, Frank's widow. Mrs. Kowalski, I've been expecting your call. I'm so sorry for your loss. Frank was a remarkable man. Thank you. Agent Chen, I need to know something. If I were to help you build a case against Marcus Hendricks, would there be any way to protect my son from prosecution? There was a long pause. Mrs. Kowalski, that would depend on the extent of your son's involvement in Hendricks' activities. Can you tell me what you know? I told her everything. About Danny's meetings with Hendricks, about the plans to sell the garage, about the lies my son had told his dying father. When I finished, Agent Chen was quiet for a long moment. Mrs. Kowalski, based on what you've told me, your son could potentially be charged as an accessory to money laundering, if we can prove he knew about Hendricks' criminal activities. But what if he didn't know? What if he was just a greedy fool who got in over his head? Then we might be able to offer him immunity in exchange for his cooperation. But Mrs. Kowalski, I have to ask, are you willing to testify against your own son if it comes to that? I looked around Frank's office, at all the evidence he'd gathered, at all the proof of the crimes Hendricks had committed and the families he'd destroyed. Agent Chen, my son has made his choices. He chose money over family, greed over honesty, lies over truth. I love him, but I won't let him destroy other people's lives just to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. I understand. Mrs. Kowalski, when would you like to meet? We have a lot to discuss. Tomorrow morning. But Agent Chen, there's something else you need to know. I've just agreed to sell my property to Hendricks. The contracts should be ready by tomorrow afternoon. What? Mrs. Kowalski, you can't go through with that sale. If you sell to Hendricks, you could be considered an accessory to. Agent Chen, I'm not going to go through with the sale. But I'm going to let Hendricks think I am, right up until the moment you arrest him. I could almost hear her smiling through the phone. Mrs. Kowalski, I think your husband would be very proud of you. I hope so, Agent Chen. I certainly hope so. After I hung up, I sat in Frank's chair and looked at the wall of evidence he'd assembled. Tomorrow, I would turn it all over to the FBI. Tomorrow, Marcus Hendricks would be arrested. And tomorrow, my son would learn that his foolish old mother had just destroyed his criminal partner and possibly his freedom. But tonight, I was going to call Danny and let him think everything was going according to his plan. The trap was about to spring, and I wanted him to be looking right at me when it did. Danny was ecstatic when I called him that evening to report on my day with Hendrix. "Mom, that's fantastic. I told you Marcus was a straight shooter. And 200,000? That's 50,000 more than we originally discussed." "He seemed very impressed with your father's car collection," I said, playing my part. "He said the cars alone were worth 50,000. See? I knew Dad's hobby would pay off eventually. Mom, this is going to set you up beautifully. $200,000, plus your share of Dad's other assets, and you'll never have to worry about money again." My share. He was still talking like the house and investments were his to distribute, like I should be grateful for whatever portion he decided to give me. "When do we sign the contracts?" I asked. Marcus said his lawyer would have everything ready by tomorrow afternoon. "We could potentially close early next week." "Mom, I'm so proud of how you handled this whole situation. You really stepped up and made some smart business decisions." He was proud of me for falling for a con game. Proud of me for being the naive old woman he'd always thought I was. "I learned from watching you, honey," I said, the lie tasting like acid. "Listen, I've been thinking. After the sale goes through, why don't you come back and stay in the house while you figure out where you want to live permanently? It doesn't make sense for you to keep sleeping in that garage." "That's very generous of you, Danny. We're family, Mom. I know I said some things the other day that came out wrong, but I want you to know that I love you and I want what's best for you." Family. Love. What's best for me? All words that had lost their meaning coming from his mouth. "I love you too, Danny. I'll see you tomorrow for the contract signing." After I hung up, I spent the evening going through Frank's files one more time, making sure I understood every detail of Hendrix's operation. Agent Chen would want to know everything, and I needed to be prepared to answer her questions. I also spent time looking at the photographs of Danny meeting with Hendrix. My son shaking hands with a criminal. My son passing documents to a man who destroyed families for profit. My son lying to his dying father about everything he was doing. The boy in those photographs was a stranger to me, but he was also still my son, and tomorrow I was going to destroy his life along with Hendrix. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, Agent Chen arrived at exactly 9 o'clock in an unmarked sedan with 2 other agents. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with short black hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything in the garage within seconds of walking through the door. "Mrs. Kowalski, I'm Sarah Chen. These are Agents Martinez and Thompson. Thank you for contacting us." I led them to Frank's office and watched their faces change as they saw the scope of his investigation. "Jesus Christ," Agent Martinez whispered, staring at the wall of photographs and documents. "Your husband built a better case than most federal task forces." Agent Chen was already examining Frank's filing system, pulling out folders and scanning their contents with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of financial crimes. "Mrs. Kowalski, this is extraordinary work. Your husband documented everything: bank transfers, shell company formations, property transactions, even recorded conversations. How long was he working on this?" "About 3 years, from what I can tell. He never said anything to me about it." "He was protecting you," Agent Thompson said, looking through a folder of photographs. "If Hendrix had discovered what Frank was doing, both of you could have been in serious danger." Agent Chen sat down at Frank's desk and opened the laptop. "We'll need to take all of this into evidence, but first I want to understand the timeline of your son's involvement. When did these meetings with Hendrix begin?" I showed her the earliest photographs Frank had taken, dated almost 2 years ago. Danny and Hendrix having lunch at an expensive restaurant, looking comfortable and familiar with each other. "Your son has been working with Hendrix for a long time, Mrs. Kowalski. Much longer than you initially indicated." "I know. I've been going through the files, trying to understand when it started and how deep it goes." Agent Chen pulled up a spreadsheet on Frank's laptop. "According to this, your son provided Hendrix with detailed financial information about your family's assets, including bank account numbers, investment portfolios, and property assessments. He also gave him copies of your medical records and insurance policies." Medical records. Insurance policies. Danny had been sharing our most private information with a criminal for nearly 2 years. What was Hendrix planning to do with all that information? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Best case scenario, he was planning to use it to pressure you into selling your property at below market prices, Agent Martinez said. Worst case, he was setting up some kind of insurance fraud. Elderly people who live alone and have valuable assets are often targets for staged accidents or medical emergencies. I felt sick. My own son had been providing information that could have been used to hurt me or kill me. Agent Chen was still scrolling through Frank's data. Mrs. Kowalski, I need to ask you something difficult. Are you prepared to testify that your son voluntarily provided this information to Hendricks? Are you prepared to testify about the conversations you've had with him regarding the property sale? Yes, I said without hesitation. Even if it means your son could face federal charges. I looked at the photographs on the wall, at the evidence of all the families Hendricks had destroyed, at the proof of my son's willing participation in those crimes. Agent Chen, my son made a choice to work with a man who destroys people's lives for money. He made a choice to betray his family's trust. He made a choice to lie to his dying father. I won't protect him from the consequences of those choices. She nodded. All right. Here's what's going to happen today. You're going to meet Hendricks as planned, you're going to act like you're ready to sign the contracts, and then we're going to arrest him. What about Danny? We'll arrest him too, but we'll offer him a deal. Full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. If he's willing to testify against Hendricks and help us recover the money that's been laundered through his operation, he might avoid prison time. And if he's not willing to cooperate? Agent Chen's expression was grim. Then he'll go down with Hendricks. The agents spent the next 2 hours going through Frank's evidence, photographing documents, copying computer files, and preparing for the afternoon's operation. They explained how the arrest would work. I would meet Hendricks and Danny at the garage as planned, act like I was ready to sign the contracts, and then give a predetermined signal that would bring in the arrest team. Mrs. Kowalski, Agent Thompson said as they were preparing to leave, I want you to understand that this operation carries some risk. Hendricks is a dangerous man, and when he realizes what's happening, he might react violently. What kind of risk? We'll have agents positioned around the building, but there will be a few minutes when you're alone with Hendricks and your son before we can move in. If either of them suspects what's happening, they might try to hurt you to prevent you from testifying. I thought about that for a moment. My son, the boy I'd raised, the man I'd loved unconditionally for 45 years, might try to hurt me to protect his criminal partner. I understand the risk, I said finally, but I'm still going to do this. Agent Chen shook my hand. Your husband would be proud of you, Mrs. Kowalski. And Mrs. Kowalski? After today, you're going to be a very wealthy woman. The federal seizure laws provide substantial rewards for people who help recover stolen assets. Based on what we've seen in these files, you could be looking at several $1 million. Several $1 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Money that would ensure I never had to depend on anyone else for anything. But more importantly, money that would come from destroying the criminal operation that had hurt so many families in my community. After the agents left, I spent the afternoon preparing for the performance of my life. I had to convince Hendricks that I was still the naive old woman he thought he was swindling, right up until the moment the FBI arrested him. At exactly 3 o'clock, I watched from the window as Danny's BMW pulled up, followed by Hendricks' Mercedes and a third car I didn't recognize. A woman in an expensive suit got out of the third car, carrying a briefcase. Probably Hendricks' lawyer, here to witness the signing of the contracts that would seal his fate. I took a deep breath, said a quiet prayer for courage, and walked to the door to greet the people who were about to destroy my family. Mrs. Kowalski, Hendricks said, giving me that predatory smile, I hope you're ready to make some money today. I've been looking forward to this all week, I replied, and for the first time in days, I was telling the absolute truth. Danny was practically bouncing with excitement as he introduced the lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Wells who specialized in real estate transactions. She had the contracts ready in her briefcase, along with a cashier's check made out to me for $200,000. Before we begin, Ms. Wells said, I need to verify your identity and your ownership of the property. I provided all the necessary documentation, including the deed Frank had left me and my driver's license. Everything was in order, exactly as it should be for a legitimate real estate transaction. Excellent, Hendricks said, rubbing his hands together. Dorothy, this is going to be the start of a beautiful partnership. After we complete this transaction, I'd love to talk to you about some investment opportunities that might interest you. Investment opportunities. He was already planning to steal more money from me. That sounds wonderful, Marcus. I trust your judgment completely. Danny beamed at me like I was his prize student. Mom, you've really learned a lot about business over the past few days. I'm impressed. I'd learned a lot, all right. I'd learned that my son was a liar and a criminal. I'd learned that the man I'd been married to for 46 years had been braver and more resourceful than I'd ever imagined. And I'd learned that sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to destroy them first. Ms. Wells spread the contracts out on Frank's workbench, explaining each section in detail. The purchase price, the closing date, the condition of the property, the inclusion of Frank's car collection. Everything was exactly as Hendricks and I had discussed. This all looks correct, I said, picking up the pen Ms. Wells offered me. Just sign on the highlighted lines, she instructed, and we'll be all set. I looked at Danny, who was watching me with eager anticipation. I looked at Hendricks, who was already counting his profits. I looked at Ms. Wells, who was probably calculating her legal fees. None of them had any idea that in about 30 seconds, their world was going to explode. I signed the first page of the contract. Then I signed the second page. As I reached for the third page, I paused and looked directly at Danny. Son, I said quietly, before I sign this last page, I want you to know something. What's that, Mom? I want you to know that your father spent the last 3 years of his life investigating Marcus Hendricks. He documented every crime, every money laundering scheme, every family that was destroyed by this man's greed. And he discovered that you've been helping Hendricks' plan to steal from your own family for almost 2 years. The color drained from Danny's face. Mom, what are you talking about? Hendricks went very still, his eyes darting toward the door. I'm talking about the fact that you've been sharing our family's private financial information with a criminal. I'm talking about the fact that you lied to your dying father about your business relationships. I'm talking about the fact that you've been planning to sell our home to a man who launders money for organized crime. Mrs. Kowalski, Hendricks said carefully, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, Marcus. I know exactly who you are and exactly what you do. And in about 10 seconds, so will the FBI. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small recording device, pressing the red button that Agent Chen had shown me earlier. The garage doors burst open simultaneously from both sides, and armed federal agents poured into the building. FBI. Everyone on the ground now. Hendricks bolted toward the back of the garage, but Agent Martinez tackled him before he'd taken 3 steps. Danny just stood there in shock, staring at me like I was some stranger who'd invaded his mother's body. Dorothy Kowalski, Agent Chen announced loudly, you are under federal protection as a cooperating witness. Ms. Wells was already on her knees with her hands behind her head, screaming something about attorney-client privilege. Hendricks was face down on the garage floor, cursing in multiple languages as Agent Martinez handcuffed him. But Danny was still staring at me. Mom, he said, his voice barely a whisper, what have you done? I've done what your father wanted me to do, I replied. I've made sure that Marcus Hendricks will never hurt another family. And I've made sure that you'll have to face the consequences of your choices. You don't understand, Danny said, tears starting to stream down his face. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just trying to help the family. I was just trying to make sure we'd all be okay. By lying to us? By working with criminals? By planning to sell our home to a man who destroys people's lives for money? I didn't know he was a criminal. I swear to God, Mom, I had no idea what he was really doing. Agent Chen approached Danny with handcuffs. Daniel Kowalski, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering and wire fraud. As she read him his rights, Danny looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Complete betrayal, absolute shock, and the dawning realization that his life as he knew it was over. Mom, he said as Agent Chen led him toward the door, I'm your son. How could you do this to me? I looked at this man who'd once been my little boy, who'd once brought me dandelions and called them flowers, who'd once cried in my arms when life hurt too much to bear. Danny, I said softly, I did this because I love you. And because sometimes, love means letting people face the consequences of their actions instead of protecting them from the truth. He was still staring at me as Agent Chen put him in the back of a federal vehicle. Still staring as they drove away, taking with them the son I'd raised and loved and lost to greed and lies and the seductive promise of easy money. After everyone was gone, I sat alone in Frank's garage, surrounded by the evidence of his secret investigation and the echoes of the life we'd built together. I had done what he'd asked me to do. I had chosen justice over family, truth over comfort, the right thing over the easy thing. But as I sat there in the silence, I wondered if Frank had understood what that choice would cost me. I wondered if he'd known that saving Danny would require destroying him first. And I wondered if, somewhere in whatever comes after death, he was proud of what his foolish old wife had accomplished, or horrified by what she'd had to become. The local news picked up the story that evening. Federal agents arrest prominent developer and businessman in multimillion-dollar money laundering scheme. They showed footage of Hendricks being led away in handcuffs, of FBI agents carrying boxes of evidence from his office, of the garage where it all went down. They didn't mention my name, thankfully. Agent Chen had insisted on keeping my identity confidential for security reasons. But sitting in Frank's garage, watching the news coverage on the small TV, I felt the weight of what I'd set in motion. Danny was being held without bond, pending a federal hearing. According to Agent Chen, who called me that evening with updates, he was cooperating fully with the investigation. Which meant he was telling them everything about his relationship with Hendricks, probably trying to minimize his own involvement while providing evidence against the bigger fish. Mrs. Kowalski, Agent Chen said, your son's cooperation is valuable, but I need you to understand something. Even with full cooperation, he's looking at significant charges. Conspiracy to commit money laundering carries a potential sentence of 20 years in federal prison. 20 years. Danny was 45. He could be an old man before he got out, if he got out. What about the deal you mentioned? Reduced charges in exchange for testimony. That's still on the table, but it depends on how much useful information he can provide. And Mrs. Kowalski, there's something else you need to know. We found evidence that your son received payments from Hendricks. Substantial payments, dating back almost 18 months. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Payments for what? Information. Every time your son provided Hendricks with documents about your family's finances, he received a payment. Usually $5,000 to $10,000. We're talking about more than $100,000 total. Danny hadn't just been naive or greedy. He'd been on Hendricks' payroll, selling out his own family for money. While Frank was dying of cancer, while I was taking care of both of them, my son had been taking cash payments for betraying us. Mrs. Kowalski? Are you still there? I'm here, I managed to say. Agent Chen, I want to see him. I don't think that's a good idea right now. He's pretty angry about the arrest, and I don't care if he's angry. He's still my son, and I want to see him. There was a long pause. All right. I'll arrange a visit for tomorrow morning. But Mrs. Kowalski, you should prepare yourself. Federal detention changes people. He might not be the son you remember. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking about the Danny I'd raised, trying to understand how that little boy had become a man who would sell out his dying father for money. I thought about all the times I'd made excuses for him, all the warning signs I'd ignored, all the moments when I'd chosen to believe the best about him instead of seeing the truth. Frank had seen it, though. Frank had known what Danny was becoming, and he tried to protect me from that knowledge until he was gone. The will that left Danny the house and me the garage wasn't just about money. It was Frank's way of making sure I'd discover the truth about our son without him having to be the one to tell me. The Federal Detention Center was a grim concrete building downtown, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. I'd never been inside a jail before, and the process of getting cleared for a visit was intimidating and humiliating. Metal detectors, background checks, forms to fill out in triplicate. When they finally led me to the visiting room, Danny was already sitting at a small table, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look sallow and sick. He'd aged 10 years in 2 days. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands shook when he tried to drink from a paper cup of coffee. "Hello, Danny," I said, sitting down across from him. He didn't look at me at first. Just stared at the table between us like it held the answers to all his problems. "They tell me you're cooperating with the investigation," I continued. "What choice do I have?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "They've got bank records showing every payment Hendricks made to me. They've got photographs of every meeting, recordings of phone conversations, copies of every document I gave him. Your husband built a case that's going to send me to prison for the rest of my life. Your father built a case against Marcus Hendricks. You built the case against yourself. Finally, Danny looked up at me. His eyes were full of anger and hurt and something that looked like genuine confusion. Mom, I don't understand. How could you do this? How could you turn your own son over to the FBI? How could you take money to betray your own family? It wasn't like that. I wasn't betraying anyone. I was trying to help. Help. I leaned forward, trying to keep my voice down in the crowded visiting room. Danny, you took over $100,000 from a criminal in exchange for information about our private finances. How is that helping? Because I knew Dad was going to die. The words exploded out of him, loud enough to draw looks from other visitors. I knew he was going to die, and I knew you'd be left with nothing. Do you have any idea what it costs to live these days? What healthcare costs for elderly people? What happens to old women who don't have family to take care of them? I stared at him. So you decided to take care of me by working with a criminal. I decided to take care of you by making sure our family had enough money to survive. Hendricks was going to develop that neighborhood anyway. With or without our cooperation, he was going to buy up those properties and tear them down. I figured we might as well profit from it instead of being victims of it. And the money he paid you? What was that for? Danny's face flushed red. That was compensation for my time. For the research I did, the contacts I made, the deals I helped put together. It was payment for betraying your family. It was payment for lying to your dying father. I never lied to Dad. You told him you'd never heard of Marcus Hendricks. I was there, Danny. I heard you lie to his face. Danny slumped in his chair, the fight going out of him as suddenly as it had appeared. I was scared, he said finally. Dad was asking questions, getting suspicious, and I was scared that if he found out about my arrangement with Hendricks, he'd cut me out of the will completely. I panicked and lied, and then it was too late to take it back. So you let him die thinking his son was an honest man. I let him die thinking his son was going to take care of his wife. Mom, everything I did was about making sure you'd be okay after Dad was gone. The house, the investments, the deal with Hendricks, all of it was about securing your future. I looked at this man who'd once been my little boy, and I felt something break inside my chest. Not just heartbreak, but something deeper. The death of hope, maybe. The final understanding that the child I'd raised was truly gone. Danny, I said quietly, if you'd really wanted to take care of me, you wouldn't have needed to lie about it. If you'd really wanted to help our family, you wouldn't have needed to work with criminals to do it. And if you'd really been thinking about my future, you would have included me in decisions about my own life. But Mom. No, let me finish. You want to know how I could turn you over to the FBI? It's because I finally understood that the son I raised, the boy I loved, was already gone. He'd been gone for years, replaced by a man who would sell out his own family for money and call it love. Danny was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he stared at me across the scarred table. Mom, please. I know I made mistakes, but I'm still your son. I'm still the same person you raised. No, Danny, you're not. The son I raised would never have taken money from a man who destroyed families. The son I raised would never have lied to his dying father. The son I raised would never have treated his mother like a problem to be managed instead of a person to be respected. I can change. I can be better. If you help me get out of this, if you talk to the FBI, tell them I was just naive, that I didn't know what Hendricks was really doing. But you did know, didn't you? Maybe not all the details, but you knew something wasn't right about those payments. You knew something wasn't right about all that cash for simple business advice. Danny's silence was answer enough. I stood up from the table. Danny, I hope someday you'll understand why I did what I did. I hope someday you'll realize that letting you face the consequences of your choices was the most loving thing I could do. Mom, please don't leave. Please don't give up on me. I looked at him one more time, this man in an orange jumpsuit who'd once been my whole world. I'm not giving up on you, honey. I'm just finally letting you grow up. I walked out of the federal detention center and drove back to the garage, where I spent the rest of the day going through Frank's possessions and trying to figure out how to rebuild a life that had been completely torn apart. That evening, Agent Chen called with more updates on the case. Mrs. Kowalski, I have some news. Based on your son's cooperation and the evidence we've gathered, we've been able to trace Hendricks' money laundering operation back almost 5 years. We're talking about over $50 million in dirty money that is processed through his development projects. $50 million. The scope of Hendricks' crimes was staggering. What does that mean for Danny? It means his cooperation is extremely valuable. The federal prosecutor is willing to recommend a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony against Hendricks and his associates. Instead of 20 years, he might be looking at 5 to 7. 5 to 7 years. Still a significant portion of Danny's life, but not the complete destruction I'd feared. And what does it mean for me? Agent Chen's voice took on an excited tone. Mrs. Kowalski, under federal law, you're entitled to a substantial reward for providing information that leads to the seizure of criminal assets. We're talking about 10% of everything we recover, which could be $5 million or more. $5 million. More money than I'd ever dreamed of having. More money than Frank and I had earned in our entire lives combined. There's something else, Agent Chen continued. We've discovered that Hendricks was planning to have you killed after the property sale went through. The words hit me like ice water. What? We found communications between Hendricks and an associate discussing the need to eliminate potential witnesses to his money laundering operation. Your husband's investigation had made Hendricks nervous, and he was concerned that you might have access to incriminating information. So Danny wasn't just helping him steal from me, he was helping him plan to murder me. We don't have any evidence that your son knew about the murder plot. But Mrs. Kowalski, if you'd gone through with that property sale, if you hadn't contacted us when you did, you might not have survived the week. I hung up the phone and sat in Frank's office, surrounded by the evidence of his love and protection, trying to process the fact that my own son had nearly gotten me killed. Frank had saved my life from beyond the grave. His secret investigation, his careful documentation, his final letter asking me to trust him one more time. All of it had been designed to protect me from a danger I'd never seen coming. And Danny, my sweet little boy who'd once brought me dandelions, had been an unwitting accessory to a plan that would have ended with his mother's murder. The irony was crushing. In trying to save Danny from the consequences of his choices, I would have gotten myself killed. In choosing to destroy his criminal partnership, I had saved both our lives. Sometimes, I realized, the most loving thing you can do for someone is to make sure they can't keep hurting themselves or the people they're supposed to love. Sometimes, the only way to save your family is to tear it apart completely. And sometimes, justice and mercy are the same thing, even when they feel like complete opposites. 3 months after Danny's arrest, I finally understood what Frank had really left me. The garage sale to Hendricks had been nullified, of course. You can't legally sell property to someone who's in federal prison awaiting trial for money laundering. But what I discovered in the weeks following his arrest changed everything I thought I knew about my inheritance. Agent Chen had been right about the reward money. The federal government seized over $60 million in assets from Hendricks' operation, and my 10% share came to exactly $6,200,000. More money than I'd ever imagined having, enough to ensure I'd never have to worry about anything material for the rest of my life. But that wasn't Frank's real gift to me. The real gift was what I found when I started cleaning out the garage more thoroughly, going through sections I'd never examined closely during those first chaotic weeks. In a locked storage room I'd initially overlooked, Frank had kept detailed records of every family Hendricks had destroyed. The Patels, who'd lost their grocery store. The Johnsons, whose landscaping business had been shut down. The Kowalskis on Oak Street, who'd lost their home to foreclosure. Dozens of families, maybe hundreds, all victims of Hendricks' systematic campaign to destroy the neighborhood so he could buy up properties cheaply. But Frank hadn't just documented their suffering. He'd also researched their current situations, tracked down their new addresses, investigated their financial circumstances. And in many cases, he'd quietly helped them. I found cancelled checks made out to cash, always in amounts small enough not to attract attention. $500 here, $1,000 there, always with a note in Frank's handwriting, for the Patel family, grocery store fund. For Maria Johnson, medical bills. For Walter Kowalski, rent assistance. My husband, who I'd thought was obsessed with an old garage and some vintage cars, had actually been running a one-man charity operation. He'd been using money he'd skimmed from Hendricks' criminal enterprise to help the families Hendricks had destroyed. The storage room also contained something else, Detailed plans for what Frank wanted me to do with the reward money. The note said, if you're reading this, then Hendricks has been arrested and you've received the federal reward for his conviction. I hope you understand now why I couldn't tell you about any of this while I was alive. I needed you to discover the truth about Danny on your own, and I needed you to make the choice about justice versus family without any pressure from me. But now that it's over, I want you to know what I hope you'll do with the money. I've included a list of every family Hendricks destroyed in this neighborhood. Most of them lost their homes, their businesses, their life savings. Some of them are elderly and living in poverty now. Some of them are young families struggling to rebuild their lives. All of them deserve better than what Hendricks gave them. I want you to give the money back to them. Not all of it. Keep enough to ensure you're comfortable for the rest of your life. But most of it should go to the people who were actually hurt by Hendricks' crimes. I know it's a lot to ask. I know $6 million could buy you a beautiful house, expensive cars, luxury vacations, everything we never had when we were younger. But I also know the woman I married, and I know she'd rather sleep peacefully knowing she'd helped people than lie awake counting money that came from other people's suffering. The choice is yours, sweetheart. It's always been yours. But I'm hoping you'll choose to be the woman I've always believed you to be. All my love. Frank. I sat in that storage room for hours, reading Frank's research on each family, understanding for the first time the true scope of what Hendricks had done to our community. These weren't just numbers in a financial crimes case. These were real people with real stories, real losses, real pain. Mrs. Patel, 73 years old, now living in a studio apartment and working part-time at a convenience store because she'd lost her grocery business and her retirement savings. The Johnson family, parents and 3 young children, living in a trailer park because they'd lost their home and their landscaping business in the same month. Walter Kowalski, 81 years old, suffering from dementia and living in a state-funded nursing home because he'd lost everything when Hendricks foreclosed on his mortgage. Dozens of stories just like these. Dozens of families destroyed so that Marcus Hendricks could clean dirty money and Danny could collect his commission checks. I made my decision that afternoon. Over the next month, I hired a lawyer, a good one, not someone like Patricia Wells who'd been helping criminals hide their money, and set up a foundation. The Dorothy and Frank Kowalski Community Recovery Fund. Its mission was simple: to provide financial assistance to families who'd been victims of predatory development practices. I kept $500,000 for myself, enough to buy a small house in a safe neighborhood and ensure I'd be comfortable for the rest of my life. The remaining $5,700,000 went into the foundation. The first checks went out 6 weeks later. Mrs. Patel received enough money to buy a small grocery store in a different neighborhood, along with funding to stock it and hire help. When I visited her at the grand reopening, she cried and tried to give me free groceries for life. I told her that the money came from her own community, from people who'd refused to let injustice have the final word. The Johnsons received enough money to buy a house and restart their landscaping business. Their children would be able to go to college now, to have opportunities their parents had thought were lost forever. Walter Kowalski received enough money to move to a private care facility, where he'd have his own room, better medical care, and visiting privileges for the few family members who were still in touch with him. 47 families total received checks from the foundation. Some got enough to restart businesses that had been destroyed. Some got enough to buy back homes they'd been forced to sell. Some got enough to pay off medical debt or send children to college or simply have a little security in their old age. Not one of them knew the money had originally come from the criminal operation that had destroyed their lives. As far as they knew, it came from the kindness of neighbors who'd seen their suffering and decided to help. I thought Frank would have liked that. The foundation also had enough money left over to continue operating for years, helping new victims of predatory development practices, fighting back against criminals who thought they could destroy communities without consequences. I thought Frank would have liked that too. Danny's trial took place 8 months after his arrest. True to Agent Chen's prediction, he received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation: 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of probation. I attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching my son testify against his former partner in crime. Danny looked different, thinner, older, more serious than he'd ever looked in his life. Prison was changing him, maybe not in the ways he'd hoped, but in ways that seemed necessary. During his testimony, He spoke about his relationship with Hendrix, about the payments he'd received, about the information he'd shared. But he also spoke about his regret, about the families he'd learned had been hurt by his actions, about the mother he'd betrayed and the father he'd lied to. I told myself I was helping my family, he said at one point, his voice barely audible in the silent courtroom. But the truth is, I was helping myself. I was greedy, and I was willing to hurt other people to get what I wanted. I'm ashamed of who I became, and I'm grateful that my mother had the courage to stop me before I could do even more damage. It was the first time I'd heard him take full responsibility for his actions, without excuses or justifications or attempts to shift blame. It was the first time in years that he sounded like the son I'd raised. After the trial ended, Hendrix received 25 years in federal prison. I waited outside the courthouse for Danny to be transferred back to his detention facility. When they brought him out in handcuffs, he saw me standing by the courthouse steps. "Mom," he called out, and the guard allowed him to stop for a moment. "I'm proud of you," I said, loud enough for him to hear. "What you did in there, testifying honestly, taking responsibility, I'm proud of you." Tears started streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Mom. For everything. For lying to Dad, for betraying the family, for putting you in danger. I'm so sorry." "I know you are, honey. And I forgive you. Do you think, when I get out, do you think there might be a place for me in your life again?" I thought about that question for a long moment, looking at my son in his prison jumpsuit, handcuffed and surrounded by federal marshals. "Danny," I said finally, "there will always be a place for you in my life. But it won't be the same place you had before. That person, the one who could lie to his dying father and work with criminals and call it love, that person is gone forever. If you want a relationship with me when you get out, it will have to be as the man you become in prison, not the man you were before you went in." He nodded, understanding what I was telling him.